Following the Golden Rule with Andrew Faas is proudly supported by Remax St. Andrews. Live and vacation by the sea. Choose wisely. Choose Remax.
Hello, my name is Andrew Faas, and welcome to Following the Golden Rule.
And I'm Jay Remer, and for 26 weeks, Andy and I will be discussing the ABCs of leadership. Last week, we covered purposeful and told you that this week we would be covering quirky. And we've changed our minds, and this week it's going to be quizzical instead of quirky. So, Andy, why did you decide to change the topic from quirky to quizzical?
Good question. Shows you're quizzical. Well, the basic reason is we're in pretty dark times in society for a variety of reasons, and I've often been accused of being overly negative and pessimistic, and that's been intentional. And yes, I want the work that I do, whether it's in writing or sessions like this, to be motivational. But in all honesty, it's very difficult to give an uplifting message, and I try as best I can to do that. Somebody even quizzed me on, why do we have such a dark background? Why wouldn't we have it lightened up and a bit of sunshine? And for the very same reason, we're dealing with topics and asking people to do self-reflection and dig pretty deep in who they are and how they behave. And unfortunately, we are in a situation where the majority of us are way too self-centered. And it's kind of a me generation, and that's led us, I think, to the situation we're in today in the world. And that's dark.
Yes.
And so now why did I pick being quizzical? And for one, there's relatively few words, or adjectives, or characteristics that start with the letter Q.
Correct.
And as you go down the alphabet, it becomes even more challenging. But I chose, let me go back a little bit and say, well, why did I choose being quirky? And for me, it's a very important characteristic, because it helps define the uniqueness in people. And I'm quirky in a lot of ways, and I hide a lot of it, and maybe I should be more out there in terms of expressing those, being authentic. Because it is a part of being authentic. It's who you are, and there's a variety of reasons you become quirky, and so it's a very it's a fun word.
It is a fun word.
Yeah, and so again, why did I pick quirky? I'm limited, but being quizzical is, I think, a fundamental to anybody who is in a leadership position to be quizzical. And again, when we look at where we're at today, we're living in a polarized environment. More so in the U.S., but we're not far off when we look at it in terms of our situation. And the reason that we're so polarized, or one of the reasons we're so polarized, is we're it's not challenging and asking people the real questions that need to be asked. And because of that, we've lost the whole concept of debating and having civil discourse. And we're throwing assertions at each other.
Yeah.
And we don't even look at that one possibility that we could be wrong. And to change that mindset, one has to be quizzical.
Yes.
And okay, you know, why do you take the position that you're taking? And I've done in some of the talks that I've given, particularly to university students, and indicate to them the most, and I ask them, well, you know, what's the most important question? And some automatically get it when they're throwing back the answer to that. And in my view, the most important question you can ask is why. And why do you do that? Why did you say that? And I believe by doing that, you can avoid doing post-mortems on situations by asking, why did this happen? And if people more took the preventative aspect by probing and saying, okay, I'm seeing these red flags, and probe and ask questions as to why these red flags or amber lights are on. And through that, you can avoid saying, we've had a suicide in our organization. Why did that happen? And the reason it happened is nobody was asking the right questions.
Right. You know, it's interesting, as children, one of the most annoying things that we do is ask why. Why? It's something that it comes naturally to us. We have this curiosity, and it may appear annoying to the person who's being asked, like our mother or whatever, but the sad thing is that it's often discouraged. Like, we're discouraged from asking why. It's like, just don't worry about it. This is just because I said so, this is the way it goes. And that tends to bleed into adulthood and into organizations, and it needs to change. And one of the questions that I had when you mentioned that you wanted to discuss this topic is, I'm wondering whether or not bystanders who make up a huge part of the population, if they are hampered from being inquisitive by the atmosphere of fear sort of that we live in.
Let me address the first part of your comment or question.
Okay.
With kids, yes, it can be very annoying. But kids are going through discovery. And I think we mentioned this in one of the last previous session on how children develop from before K1 to going through universities. And the first part, as they're children, even before K1, they start asking, you know, the why. And as they go through the educational system, it shifts in terms of their being talked to and being taught to memorize versus being taught to think. And when I went to school, there's like being in debating clubs were very popular, and that's declined over the years.
Yes.
And it's getting back to So I can answer that. The last part of your question related to more of what occurs with bystanders in the workplace environment. It's because they're in command and control environments, and where obedience is expected. People are, in essence, not allowed to ask a question. And the number of leaders that I've talked to who view somebody challenging by putting their hand up and saying, wait a minute, isn't that inconsistent with what we stand for, or doesn't it conflict with something else? Many leaders in those command control environments consider that disrespectful. And part of that may be the way that they grew up in an organization or their background where it was disrespectful to ask a question. But in the year 2020, those managers and leaders who are not out there understanding how their employees feel, and more importantly, why they feel the way they do. And in Canada, if leaders and managers did that, we would not be in a situation where almost one half of the Canadian workforce want to quit. And this is not a pre-COVID statistic. It's in a period of time when unemployment is at an all-time high.
Yes.
And it shows that half of our workers have in essence checked out.
Yeah.
And people wonder why our GDP, gross national product, is at a dismal low. That is the reason for it. And people who have checked out are certainly not working to their full potential.
Right.
And from this point forward to whenever, we cannot afford to have people or organizations not work towards that full potential.
Yeah. It amazes me that leadership isn't more anxious or more encouraging of all of the stakeholders for their opinions. It's an opportunity that's just simply being missed.
Totally.
Yeah.
But again, it gets back to command and control. They think that if they get input from others, it somehow diminishes their dictatorship.
Well, it does. It does dilute their dictatorship, but that is something that they should look upon favorably. And because I think that until that, and we've discussed this many times, until people learn the benefits to collecting other people's perspectives, and the benefit of that is to clarify your own perspective, perhaps learn something, I think that we're not going to move forward.
I'll give you a bit of a maybe a reason for that, or rationale for that. And as you grow in an organization, people tend to feed you material and people tend to give you answers to questions or presentations on what they think you want to hear. And a great example of that is employee engagement surveys. When I go into an organization and I ask them, how engaged are your employees? They show me the reports and it's all glowing. And there may be a few warts that they have to kind of work on, and the board gets that result touted by the CEO, here's how, in their interpretation, happy our employees are.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do an assessment on the employee survey and draw out of the questions and answers, okay, to what extent do people trust? To what extent do people feel stable, secure, and safe?
Mm-hmm.
To what extent is there a sense of purpose? To what extent is there a sense of efficacy? To what extent can people speak truth to power?
Mm-hmm.
And when I reconcile the answers that they have in the survey, which is glowing, to those conditions, it doesn't reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't reconcile because the surveys were not asking the right questions.
Right. It is discouraging. And so, Andy, what have you found in your career because you are a curious person, what have been some of the great benefits to you for being quizzical?
I think the biggest one is, and I thought about this quite a while, and I looked at it in terms of some real successful people that I've developed. And I've developed myself in terms of taking on that challenger role. And a previous boss of mine said I was the worst employee he's ever had because I kept, being that kid. Why?
Yeah.
And he gave me the biggest compliment and said that, you became my best employee because I always knew that you would tell me what I needed to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I tried to ingrain in everybody that worked directly for me,
Mm-hmm.
and insisted that they ingrain that in everybody that they were responsible for. And I've seen people not succeed, and I've seen people flourish.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the biggest advantage that I can.
Mm-hmm. I read recently, like yesterday, a fascinating report about a 14-year-old from Frisco, Texas, who won the 3M Young Scientist Challenge, along with the $25,000 check that she got. She's working toward a discovery that could provide a potential therapy for COVID-19. This is a 14-year-old who a year earlier had, she's very sciencey and curious. She was really trying to discover a molecule that could link to the influenza. And then she shifted to SARS, and now she's on to COVID-19 at the age of 14, and she's done amazing work. The question to her was, what is the most important thing, do you think? And she said, never stop being curious. And I thought, that is brilliant. And I further went on to think, if that is what this new generation is going to use as a backdrop, a philosophy, we have got a bright future ahead of us, at least from this perspective. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, I go back to my comments and criticism of education, getting away from the pure memorization to learning how to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And learning how to learn is having that level of curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can get that level of curiosity with everyone,
mm-hmm.
regardless of age,
mm-hmm.
and get back to the whole issue of the world is full of wonder, and only if you look for it and ask
the
right questions.
One of the one of the interesting things that's come out of this whole self-reflective exercise that we've been in the midst of is how the words differ in different people's minds. So, for instance, you mentioned a moment ago respect, which is not a word that we're going to be discussing particularly, but it does have different meanings to different people, just like all of the other words that we have. And I think that that should conjure up a curiosity in our own minds. Like, I wonder how you feel. What does curiosity mean to you versus what does it mean to me? And I think that it's a way that we can interrelate all of the words that we've been discussing because each one is important and it has they have multiple definitions, and how we apply them in our lives matters.
Absolutely, and overlaps. But let's use the word respect and respectful, because they are two different words.
Mm-hmm.
So treating people with respect is asking them the question in a respectful way.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting to people to differentiate and not get into a semantic exercise.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the word that you came up with in terms of respect and respectful, people often connotate the disrespectful side of it.
Well, I think the thing is that with a lot of the people that I've worked with, and I'm sure you have too, respect, and when I grew up, respect was obedience. It
Yes.
had nothing to do with anything else. And I think that that is a problem that needs to be looked at, because I think people need to understand really what is respect
Yes.
all about.
Yes.
And it's different it may be different in just generationally, it could be different.
So, I would encourage everybody to read Stanley Milgram's Perils of Obedience. And yes, many people were raised where it was disrespectful to be inquisitive and ask questions that are elephants in the room. And this is where bystanders should be challenging.
Mm-hmm.
In a respectful way,
Mm-hmm.
what is going on. And there's a lot of elephants in the room.
Yes.
And we should not be afraid to, or ever be in a position to have our people as leaders of organizations or as leaders of families or whatever unit. We should never create a fear to have people ask a question.
Yes. I have found in my experience, and I can remember because I have been involved in volunteer boards for many, many years. And I remember in the beginning when I was a fledgling, I was reticent to ask questions that seemed to me to be obvious, like I should know the answer to this question, and so if I ask the question, I'll look foolish, so I won't ask the question. As I've moved ahead, I've listened to a lot of questions that I thought, well, that's a pretty basic question that you should know the answer to, and people are afraid. So I think people need to come out and not be afraid to ask the important questions, because they may be very foundational, and it could really tilt an entire sort of way of going if it's not clearly understood. Everybody needs to understand these basic questions, and they are the elephants in the room.
Yes, and one of the other things I do, particularly in talking to any audience, and how many seminars have you gone to where the facilitator says, there are no stupid questions. Well, that's stupid. There are stupid questions. And they're stupid when you know the individual who's asking them could have done his homework and or listened to what was just said. The answer is very obvious. And I don't react well when that happens. and I make no bones about it.
Right.
Because I'm an impatient person. But I also feel that it blocks others from asking a thoughtful question. And the other thing about being quizzical is not expecting an immediate answer. And I often say, listen, I don't want an answer right away because I know you're going to say no, and I want you to think about it.
Yeah.
And this is not an academic exercise here. So think about it and come back to me, and then we can talk about it. And so it's a it's a topic I think I could talk about until the elephants leave the room.
Well, that's not likely to happen. Well, we just have another minute or so left, Andy. I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts on Quizzical that you'd like to share.
Well, same old is I'm spouting off and pontificating on how I feel about it. What I think people have to do is ask themselves the questions, be quizzical in your self-reflection.
I think that changing from quirky to quizzical was brilliant, and I thank you for doing that and for sharing your thoughts on a word that was rarely used. And thank you for joining us this week, and next session we will be discussing R is for relatable.
Following the Golden Rule with Andrew Faas is proudly supported by Remax St. Andrews. Live in vacation by the sea, choose wisely, choose Remax.